Kakahi, my brothers, my sisters, let us now enter the spiritual realm of our ancestors.
On a clear night, more than 500 years ago, two elderly Behikes, steeped in tribal wisdom and experience, climbed to the summit of a steep hill on the Caribbean island of Antigua and positioned themselves at a predetermined spot to carry out a ceremonial observation of supreme importance.
The two elders, one man, the other a woman, positioned themselves next to a massive stone that their ancestors had erected there on top of that hill. From that point, they raised their sight up toward a distance.
They fixed their vision upon a huge standing stone erected to the east of them. From that position up there on top of that hill, these two sages prepared to serve as ceremonial witnesses to the rising of the sun. The sunrise on that morning would manifest behind that other standing stone to the east of the two sages. The tilt of the axis of the Earth's globe and the spin of our planet around the sun each year had created the effect that the sun could only rise in that manner from behind that particular magic stone two special times during the yearly cycle: on the first day of spring, and then later on the first day of autumn. On this particular morning, when the glowing face of the sun began to emerge behind the sacred boulder, those two Behikes started to shake their rattles energetically and sang the traditional songs of spring. The sun emerged slowly behind the standing ancestral stone and rose into the sky, illuminating the world with its blessed light, marking the end of the dry season that had reigned during the 3 long months of winter. Once the sun had risen, the two Behikes descended down the hill and joined the community of the Ucayeke to begin the celebrations of that important day, the spring equinox.
The dry season that manifests itself during the winter time in the Caribbean is like a time of death, throughout which the Tainos could not plant new crops.
But with the beginning of the gentle rains of spring, the conuco fields previously cleared and prepared by the men of the Ucayeke would turn into a beehive of activity where the women and girls of the village used their koa digging sticks to open holes in the fertile earth, in which they planted yucca, maize, beans, and squashes that would eventually feed their children for the rest of the year. Our Taino ancestors evolved their culture in a geographic region called the Caribbean. This zone, composed of archipelagos, islands, and cays, is located in the tropical region of the Northern Hemisphere, as part of the American continental mass. The Northern Hemisphere is that portion of our planet, the Earth, that lies north of an imaginary line which circles the globe of the Earth right along its midpoint, like a belt, dividing it into equal halves, the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. This imaginary line is called the equator. The fact that our ancestors lived in the Northern Hemisphere is extremely important to our explanation, since this fact influenced their seasons and the astronomical manifestations that they experienced.
The genesis of Taino culture, including their traditions dealing with the seasons of the year and their astronomical observations, has its origins mainly in the traditions and mythology of indigenous nations who arose out of a region of South America along the banks of the Orinoco River.
From that place, which also lies in the tropical region of the Northern Hemisphere, those people migrated in their canoes into the Caribbean Sea and populated our Antillean islands, bringing with them many of those beliefs that they had developed in their original Orinoco homeland.
These people discovered the manner in which the sun moves each day during its journey across the dome of the sky, from east to west. They realized the changes that this daily trek undergoes throughout the length of the annual cycle.
Once in the Caribbean, our ancestors continued their astronomical observations. They established links between those celestial manifestations and the climate changes that manifest during the 4 seasons of the year.
They noticed also the changes that manifest themselves in the night sky, how the movements of the stars shift during the night, and the differences that reveal themselves from spring to summer to fall to winter, and the constellations that shine each night in the tropical sky. These observations of the seasons and the movements of the heavenly bodies influence their beliefs and traditions at a fundamental level.
The dramatic event that I narrated at the beginning of my presentation, with the two Behikes observing the rise of the sun from behind the sacred standing boulder on top of the magic hill, was explained by the research of scientific teams who have carried out investigations atop that hill on the island of Antigua. That place is called Green Castle Hill, and the research was described by the scholar Maura Imbert in her paper, The Possible Influence of Astronomy on the Culture of Ceramic Age Pre-Columbian Inhabitants of Green Castle Hill in Antigua. The Taino ancestors observed that throughout the year, the arch that the sun traces across the dome of the sky each day changes gradually from day to day. In other words, the place where the sun would emerge, the hill, or the tree from behind which the solar disk would rise on a spring morning, was not the same place where it would rise on a summer morning, and then it would rise from behind a different hill or tree in the autumn and winter. These differences indicated to the Taino ancestors how to recognize in which season of the year they happened to be. On a spring morning, the sun would rise from behind a specific mountain, and its trek across the sky from east to west took a specific path. On a summer morning, the sun would rise from behind a different mountain, and its path across the sky was also different. These differences in the path of the sun's daily trek across the sky can be defined in this manner. The arch of the sun's daily journey always begins in the east at dawn and ends in the west at dusk. This happens every day without fail. But in the winter, the Taino ancestors observed that this arch was tilted dramatically towards the south. It is as if the sun itself had traveled south during the death season of winter. After the day of the winter solstice, the arch traced by the sun daily across the sky began to rise gradually, a little bit more each day, bringing the sun back higher towards the north, returning journeying back, bringing with it the season of life, of rebirth, the season of the rains, the spring season. The ancient Tainos awaited that day with great anticipation. The day when the sun would again rise from behind the sacred boulder atop the magic hill. The day of the spring equinox. When the two elderly Behikes came down off that hill, they brought with them the good news that everyone was expecting. The springtime was about to burst into being. The season of the gentle rains would start. After the spring equinox, the arch of the sun continues to rise gradually higher and higher into the sky each day. This arch finally reaches a point on a certain day in May when the sun actually travels straight across the very top of the sky, passing right over our heads. The Taino ancestors would have to look straight up to see the sun on that day. This is now known as the Zenith passage of the sun, and it occurs only in the tropics. In the Caribbean, the sun's journey continues to move north after the day of the Zenith passage in May. The arch continues to tilt further and further towards the north until it reaches the extreme end of its inclination. This happens around June 21st and is called summer solstice. That day is the farthest that the sun's arch will travel north and happens to be the longest day and shortest night of the year. After the summer solstice, the arch of the sun across the sky begins to go back again towards the south. There's another zenith passage in July or August, during which the sun passes straight over our heads, and then after that, the arch keeps tilting towards the south farther and farther, eventually reaching the point of the autumn equinox in September. That first day of autumn in September marks the time during which some of the food plants of the Taino Conuco, such as maize, begin to be harvested. This is the beginning of the season of death, during which certain plants, representing the vegetable spirit of life, yokahu, sacrifice themselves to realize their destiny as life-giving food that feeds the human generations. Yokahu dies in the fall, and his soul begins its journey back to the maternal uterus of the Great Mother Atabe. This uterus resides in the inner recesses of the terrestrial underground. Yokahu's soul travels through the sacred caves, entering into the interior of the symbolic body of Atabe. Finally, the arch of the sun reaches its extreme southern inclination again. That day is the winter solstice, the shortest day and longest night. On that day, the soul of Yokahu reaches its goal deep in the underworld. It reaches the womb of the Great Mother Atabe and attaches itself to the uterine wall, turning into a divine fetus, which will then gestate there, awaiting its eventual rebirth. That day of rebirth is the morning when the sun again rises behind the sacred boulder atop the magic hill, and the two elderly Behikes once more travel down the hill to join the rest of the community and begin the spring equinox celebrations. On that first day of the rainy season, Yokahu is born anew and begins the yearly cycle all over again. We call this annual cycle the Sun Path Dance. In our tradition, we perceive this cycle's dance in the form of a journey that has the shape of a figure 8 around the sacred medicine wheel. The journey begins in the cardinal direction of the south on spring equinox in March. It continues around throughout the season of gentle rains during the 3 months of spring until it reaches the cardinal direction of the east on summer solstice in June. On that day, the journey starts a straight line right through the center of the medicine wheel from east to west via the summer season and heavy rains and hurricanes. This straight line trek concludes at the cardinal direction of the west, the place of the autumn equinox. This is the time of Yokahu's death. At this point, the trek travels towards the north. Yokahu's journey to the maternal womb. When the journey arrives in the north, Yokahu reaches his mother's uterus. Now the journey moves straight down across the center of the medicine wheel, from north to south. Upon arrival in the cardinal direction of the south, the journey reaches spring equinox. The sun rises behind the sacred boulder atop the magic hill. Yokahu is reborn. The two Behikes again make their way down the hill to start the equinox ceremonies, and the cycle starts all over again. The equinox ceremony begins a season of spring celebrations that run parallel to the planting and cultivating activities in the rain-drenched Conuco fields. This season of spring ceremonies concludes with a celebration that takes place in late May, right before summer solstice. This ceremonial planting season that lasts almost throughout the whole spring is a period of joy and rejoicing. As mentioned before, this season of joy starts with an equinox ceremony in March. Around the end of May, the second ceremony is celebrated to conclude the season. Throughout this period, from the first spring ceremony to the last spring ceremony, the women busily work the fields, appealing to the Earth Mother for a bountiful harvest. The birth of the sun from behind the sacred boulder atop the magic hill initiates the equinox ceremony of March. But a totally different heavenly manifestation ignites the ceremony of late May. This celebration is sparked by the movements of a nighttime constellation known now by the name of Pleiades, but our Taino ancestors knew it by the name Sirik. In the creation narrative of our people, which we call the Taino Chronicles, an episode is told which speaks of the primordial cacique chief, Guahayona. The story tells us that Guahayona reigns over the tribe that lives inside the ancestral cave Casibahagua. At that time, the primordial ancestors anxiously awaited the time when the outside world would be fully formed and they would all be able to exit the cave and inhabit it. But a series of setbacks prevented the community from getting out, and so they all suffered from hunger and lack of healing herbs. The cacique chief, Guajayona, arrived at the conclusion that all these failures were due to the fact that his people did not demonstrate the proper amount of respect and obedience to him. He grew angry and vengeful. Finally, he abandoned the cave, taking all the women with him and leaving the men and children to their fate. The suckling babies were deprived of their mother's milk and died of hunger. This caused a catastrophic situation in the ancestral human community. The division and antagonism between the men and the women. Eventually, Chief Guajayona and the women would pay dearly for their sin. But the immediate effect of their action included the tragic death of the babies. The ancient ones tell us that those hungry babies screamed for their mother's breast, crying. Suddenly, their cries turned into the calls of little frogs that sing in the spring. The babies themselves turned into frogs and rose into the sky to become the 7 stars of the constellation Cyric, the Pleiades. Every year, in late May, when this constellation assumes a specific predetermined position in the night sky, many tribes of South America and the Antilles celebrate that Cyric ceremony that marks the latter part of spring. This is a time when the members of the community express rituals that indicate antagonism and division between men and women. Frogs become an important feature of the ceremony. Although this Cyric ceremony at the latter part of May commemorates negative behavior on the part of Chief Guajayona and the women, ultimately this particular ceremony becomes part of the general sense of joy and celebration, which is the most important element of the spring ceremonies. The frogs are spiritual bearers of the rainy sky, and thus the 7 stars of Cyric become symbols of blessing rather than rebellion. Likewise, we today also continue this tradition of the spring season in the Canay Circle. Every year we celebrate the sacred ceremony of equinox around March 21st. This carries on the tradition which was promoted more than 5 centuries ago by those 2 elderly Behiques who descended from the top of the sacred Green Castle Hill to begin the equinox ceremony all those years ago. An integral element of the March ceremony is the honoring of the sacred serpent, the totem animal of the fertile Mother Atabey. The serpent, with its long pole-like body, which brings to mind the shape of the koa digging stick that is the most important tool of the cultivator. As part of this equinox ceremony, we also carry out planting rituals, just like they did back then. Then, almost 3 months later in May, we celebrate the second spring ceremony, Cyric. Guided by the appearance of the 7 frog stars of the Pleiades, we honor the rain-bearing frog spirits, and just like our ancestors, again we celebrate planting rituals.